Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to folks around the world. As you've heard, my name is Andrew Potts, and it's my pleasure to chair this timely panel with such a distinguished group of speakers. Today's the day in the Heritage and our Sustainable Futures Conference, when we focus on the intersection of cultural heritage, climate change, and sustainable development. I'm going to be chairing the panel, and I want to just explain to you a little bit about the objectives of the panel and how it will go. As I think probably most of you know, climate change is one of the defining challenges of our time. Human actions like the burning of fossil fuels and deforestation are releasing unprecedented concentrations of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. That's trapping heat, warming the globe, and exacerbating hazards like sea level rise, storminess, desertification, changing seasonality. Those hazards are having catastrophic impacts on both human and natural systems, affecting biodiversity, increasing disease, threats to health, loss of life, mass displacement, and of course, impacts on cultural heritage in all its richness and diversity. At the same time, though, cultural heritage is an asset to communities in climate action. It's a source of resilience. In 2019, my organization, ICOMOS, the International Council on Monuments and Sites, released a report called The Future of Our Past. That report tries to scope the remit of cultural heritage in helping to achieve all of the major areas of climate action as set out in the Paris Agreement, which is sort of the international framework for climate action. So that report looks at mitigation. How can cultural heritage help reduce greenhouse gases, which are the cause of climate change? It looks at adaptation. How can cultural heritage help us adapt to the change we've already caused? It looks at the role of cultural heritage in loss and damage. We can't prevent loss to all heritage values from the climate change we've already caused. And so how do we help communities prepare for that? And what's the role of cultural heritage in building ambition to act on climate and capacity? This session today is very much in line with the messages from the ICOMOS Future of Our Past report. Today, we're going to look at how we can shift research investigations from the protection of heritage against climate change to also considering the potential for heritage in tackling climate change and its impacts, including supporting a transition to low carbon futures. We'll look at how we can use heritage as a resource to inform climate change mitigation strategies, what kind of future research, practical actions, and partnerships are needed, and how can researchers work with practitioners and policymakers to maximize the ways heritage can contribute to SDG 2, 12, and 13, among others. We know that climate change is incompatible with the type of sustainable development we want. Both the extractive, non-circular, make, take, waste economic models that have given us climate change, and then of course also the increased threat profile resulting from climate change, are hampering global efforts towards sustainable development. So how do we merge the sustainable development agenda and the climate action agenda, and what's the role of cultural heritage in that? The goal of the session is to stimulate discussion on that topic, but then ultimately lead to some concrete suggestions on how culture-based climate action strategies can contribute to sustainable development. And those specific ideas will be included in the conference outcomes. Just a little bit about the flow of the session. We're going to start with a panel with three distinguished speakers. Dr. Sadeep Hazar Singh, Dr. Albino Japello, and Ms. Alice Lyle will each make presentations. And then after that, we'll have a Q&A session. Following the Q&A session, we're going to move to breakout rooms, and we hope that each of you will join us in one of those breakout rooms. I want to mention to you the questions that are going to be discussed in the breakout rooms. I want to mention them now so that you can have them in mind as you hear the presentations. We'll look at how cultural heritage can better contribute to tackling climate change and its impacts. What policy change would you like to see on this topic at any level, national, international, for example? What kind of future research and practical actions are needed? And what can we do to improve partnership collaborations on this topic? And so Those are the questions that we'll take on in the breakout rooms, and I think you'll hear plenty during the panel discussion that will help inform those conversations. And so with those preliminaries, I'd like to proceed now to our panel discussion. And I'm going to ask each of our panelists to introduce themselves and then give their presentations. And our first presenter will be Dr. Sandeep Hazar Singh, Research Fellow in the History Department of the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences at the Open University, UK. Sandeep, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Andrew. I just want to start by showing a very short clip of a woman smallholding farmer talking about aspects of her life as a farmer. So Douglas, ready to go.
ಇವಾಗ ನಮ್ಮ ಮದುವೆ ಆದ್ಮೇಲೆ ಕೆಲಸಕ್ಕೆ ಶುರು ಮಾಡ್ತೀವಲ್ಲ ನಾವು, ಹಂಗಾಗಿ ಅವ್ರ ಪದ್ಧತಿ ಉಳಿಸ್ಬೇಕು ಅಂತ ಅಂದ್ಬಿಟ್ಟು ನಾವು ಅವಾಗಿಂದ ಶುರು ಮಾಡ್ತೀವಿ. ನಾವು ಹಿಂಗೆ ಕೆಲಸ ಮಾಡುವಾಗ ಎಲ್ಲರೂ ಜನಗಳೆಲ್ಲ ಜೊತೆ ಕೂಡಿ ಹಾಡಬೇಕು ಅನ್ನಿಸ್ತು. ಅವಾಗ ಎಲ್ಲರೂ ಜೊತೆಲಿ ಇವತ್ತು ಹಾಡ್ದಂಗೆನೇ ಹಾಗೆಲ್ಲ ಹಾಡಿ ರೂಢಿ ಮಾಡ್ಕೊಂಡ್ವಿ. ಹಾಡು ಅಂತಂದ್ರೆ ಇವಾಗ ದೇವ್ರ ಮೇಲೆ ಹಾಡುತ್ತೆ, ಏನಾದರೂ ನಮ್ಮ ಇದಕ್ಕೆ ಇವ್ರ ಬಿಸಿಲಲ್ಲಿ ನಾನು ನೆನೀತಾ ಇರ್ತಾರೆ ಅಂತ ಅಂದ್ಬಿಟ್ಟು ದೇವ್ರಿಗೂ ಒಂದು ಸ್ವಲ್ಪ ಕರುಣೆ ತೋರಿ ನಮ್ಮ ಕೂಗ ದೇವ್ರಿಗೂ ಕೇಳಿಸ್ಕೊಟ್ಟು, ಹಂಗಾಗಿ ಅದರಿಂದಾದ್ರೂ ನಮಗೆ ಒಂದು ಸ್ವಲ್ಪ ನೆಮ್ಮದಿ ಸಿಗುತ್ತೆ ಅಂತ ಅಂದ್ಬಿಟ್ಟು ನಾವು ದೇವ್ರ ನೆನೆಸ್ಕೊಂಡು ಹಾಡಿರ್ತೀವಿ. ಇವಾಗ ಯಾವುದೋ ಒಂದು ಮನೆ ಟೆನ್ಷನ್ ಇರ್ತದೆ, ಅದನ್ನೆಲ್ಲ ನಾವು ಮರೆತು ಇಲ್ಲಿ ಜಮೀನಾಗಿ ಕೆಲಸ ಮಾಡುವಾಗ ಆ ಹಾಡುಗಳು ಹೇಳ್ಕೊಂಡು ನಮ್ಮ ಕೃಷಿ ಜೀವನ ಅಂತಂದ್ರೆ ಫಸ್ಟು ವಾತಾವರಣ ಚೆನ್ನಾಗಿತ್ತು, ಮಳೆ ಎಲ್ಲ ಚೆನ್ನಾಗಿ ಬೀಳ್ತಾ ಇತ್ತು. ಅವಾಗ ಗುಣನೂ ತಂಪಾಗಿರ್ತಿತ್ತು, ಬೆಟ್ಟ ಗುಡ್ಡ ಸಾಲು ಎಲ್ಲ ಚೆನ್ನಾಗಿತ್ತು. ಅವಾಗ ಕಡಿತಾ ಇರ್ಲಿಲ್ಲ ಮರ ಗಿಡಗಳನ್ನೆಲ್ಲ, ಅದರಿಂದ ವಾತಾವರಣ ಮಳೆ ಕಡಿಮೆ ಜಾಸ್ತಿ ಆಗಿ ಬಿಸಿಲು ಕಡಿಮೆ, ವಾತಾವರಣದಲ್ಲಿ ಬೆಳೆ ತಂಪಾಗಿತ್ತು. ಹಂಗಾಗಿ ಬಿಸಿಲು ಜಾಸ್ತಿ ಇರೋದು. ಇವಾಗ ರಾಗಿ ಮಳೆ ಚೆನ್ನಾಗಿ ಬಂದಿತ್ತು, 5 ತಿಂಗಳ ರಾಗಿ ಚೆನ್ನಾಗಿ. ಇವಾಗ ಅಂತಂದ್ರೆ ಮಳೆ ಕಡಿಮೆ, 3 ತಿಂಗಳ ರಾಗಿ ನಾವು ಆ 3 ತಿಂಗಳು ಸಿಗ್ಲಿಲ್ಲ ಅಂತ ಆ ಬೆಳೆ ಮೇಲೆ ಅವು ಪರಿಣಾಮ.
Right. Okay. So I think we may have missed the sound regarding the singing, but never mind. So here, Shivamma talks about, in quite a vivid way, some aspects of her life as a farmer. The first aspect of heritage she talks about are the songs passed down through the generations, songs that women farmers sing to maintain this important oral tradition. The second aspect is the ragi, which is finger millet, millets having occupied a central role in the foodways of the rural population right from the beginnings of agriculture in this region. She then goes on to recall changes in the local climate with a decline in rainfall and drier soils, requiring a shift in the traditional pattern of cultivation from the 5-month to the 3-month finger millet varieties. She suggests that the impact of climate change caused by deforestation has been felt not only by humans, but also by animals who, deprived of previous sources of forest foods, now increasingly prey on the farmers' crops. Shivamma was part of 17 audio and filmed oral history interviews with women farmers carried out in 2018 in the context of a collaborative project on changing farming lives in South India. For us, one of the main lessons learned from these conversations was that women's central role in preserving farming and food cultural practices need to be recognized in heritage discourses as one of the main pillars of sustainable development. Shivamma's reference to the change from the 5-month to the 3-month finger millet variety was echoed by other farmers interviewed and represents really an important climate change adaptation strategy. This is based on 2 crucial aspects of millet heritage, the first of which is their local knowledge of indigenous seeds. As one male farmer explained to us, quote, "While it is still we men who mainly decide on what crops to grow, it is the women who provide the seeds, the nurturing, and the know-how to make a success of the crops. From a very young age, girls are taught by mothers and grandmothers how to sow and preserve seeds, so they become experts in weeding and selecting the seeds to be preserved." In this context, repeated seed saving of heirloom or heritage varieties over generations provide the store of knowledge that enables the selection of seeds from plants that are more resistant and adaptable to changing weather conditions, while also at the same time helping local communities maintain their food culture and security. Typically, these farmers intercrop millets with legumes and pulses, ensuring both diversity in production and resilience in hard times. Moreover, as a species, finger millet has inbuilt flexible and adaptive capacities, able to thrive at higher land temperatures and in soils with greater salinity compared with other cereal crops. Millets also have a higher carbon absorption capacity and use water more efficiently, requiring just 1/5 of the amount needed to grow rice, which is their main food rival in southern India. The second important aspect of heritage is their traditional knowledge of the different rains during the agricultural season, acquired from family elders over generations. Although farmers closely follow official weather forecasts, they also rely on their own forecasting abilities based on their understanding of the 27 different rains established by ancient Indian astronomy. These rains continue to guide the sequence of farmers' tilling and sowing activities. Predicting the arrival or failure of these rains is based on close observation of animal and insect life. The women tell us that farmers can predict the coming of rain when, for instance, the koila, which is the Asian cuckoo, starts singing, or when frogs make loud noises at night. Also when anthills begin to appear and when they see ants carrying grass and millet seeds to their dens as food. One farmer remembered that during a particularly severe recent drought, there were no millet seeds left to sow, so the farmers dug up the anthills and were able to find and sow some seeds. One farmer recalled, "It was the ants who shared and gave us their seeds and preserved us from hunger and hardship." Such testimonies also suggest that heritage needs perhaps to make more room for more than human perspectives and integrate alternative epistemologies based on interactions between people and non-human entities. This would offer new possibilities for recognizing and valuing non-secular worlds and cultures. Indeed, farming ways of life remain nourished and sustained by wider systems of folk religious faith, which represent another aspect of intangible heritage. Farming and food-centered activities typically blend the secular and the spiritual, involving rituals and performances that reach out to the divine, as good crops and food provision are ultimately believed to be the consequences of divine blessing. As glimpsed on the video, one such performance is the singing of farming folk songs that evoke religious beliefs involving gods and particularly goddesses. These songs provide women farmers with an uplifting emotional resource which contributes to their overall resilience while reinforcing bonds of conviviality and community. One farmer told us, quote, "Sometimes while working, we sing to the rain god so that he grants us rain. One of us women would say to the others, 'Look, it's not raining, let's sing.' If the rains then arrive, they feel boundless joy," she confessed. So in this context, emotion and spirituality should be seen as crucial enabling dispositions for sustainable farming and climate adaptive practices. So to conclude, just with one provocation, while the valuing and public recognition of cultural heritage in the context of farming and food is clearly crucial to the realization of many of the UN's Sustainable Development Goals, the direction of travel in terms of policy making by both government and transnational bodies has for some time been heading in exactly the opposite direction. Here, heritage seems to be off the agenda, as shown, for instance, in the Indian government's proposed new farming legislation. In its attack on the very foundations of smallholder farming, these laws are bound to the undermining and denial of farming heritages and associated modes of local knowledge. As we've seen on the news recently, this has led to an unparalleled protest movement against the Modi government, in which the issues of farming, food, and climate change have been simultaneously highlighted and have come together in a very interesting way. The proposed legislation is merely the latest episode in policy directives that have over the past 70 years sought to embrace efficiency through industrial production, deregulation, specialization, and trade via private corporations aimed at serving global markets. They have been spearheaded by transnational institutions such as the WTO and the OECD, which continue to press this agricultural strategy even in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic. Yet, while the pandemic has heightened food insecurity across the world due to loss of income, illness, and social inequalities, emerging evidence suggests that small farmers producing for local food needs across short supply chains have shown greater resilience than producers who focus on specialized crops for distant global export markets, which have been severely disrupted by the pandemic. In the light of lessons emerging from the current crisis, I end with this question, which is there now a case for stronger UNESCO engagement with civil society oppositional groups committed to sustainable farming and the cultural heritages that underpin it in the era of COVID and the Anthropocene? Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Sandeep, for that very rich presentation. Now we're going to move to our second speaker, which is Dr. Albino Jopela. Albino is the head of programs at the African World Heritage Fund in Johannesburg. He's also the chair of the Africa and the Arab States region for the Climate Heritage Network, where I get a chance to work with Albino. Albino, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and greetings, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here and share some of the work that we do at the Africa World Heritage Fund, and also to contribute to the reflection and debate. Okay, so the Africa World Heritage Fund was created out of the realization from African state parties to the World Heritage Convention of a need for an institution that will support the implementation of the World Heritage Convention. And that came out of the reflection at the end of the first cycle of the periodic reporting for the region. So that is the background or the main reason for the creation of the fund, which then followed two processes. So one was the creation through the Africa Union, by the African Union member states, and the second in 2006 and hosted by South Africa. And then the second process is then the adoption by UNESCO and now being a category 2 under the species of UNESCO. So in essence, the fund looks at investing in heritage and contributing not only to transform the lives and livelihood throughout the continent, but also to provide tangible benefits to the custodians of this heritage. In terms of objectives, we can look into 5 main areas. So the first is to address the issue of underrepresentation of African sites on the World Heritage List. The second, also assist in terms of conservation and management, but also contribute to the rehabilitation of the sites that, for several reasons, are inscribed in the World Heritage List in danger. And then one of the key strategies here is to always ensure capacity building of professionals and communities, but also looking into how heritage can provide tangible benefits. So if we look into the evolution of what has happened in terms of implementation of the convention between the first cycle and the second cycle and where we are now, one can see in the third column that in a number of items, there has been a positive trend, except in the last one, when it comes to World Heritage List in danger, we find that over the last decade or so, the number of sites increase, and this is the point that we will then come to it later. So if I may focus on two main areas of the great challenges of the fund. So the first one has been how to contribute to that better representation on the World Heritage List. And we find that despite the efforts since the creation of the fund, but also with the work of other partners, the continent still underrepresented. So if we look at Sub-Saharan Africa, accounts for less than 9% of the whole World Heritage List. And if we put the whole continent together, including North Africa, it does not reach to 13% of the over 1,100 sites on the list. Another critical area of concern is then related to the factors that actually affect those properties. And here, the situation is even more complicated because if we look only at Sub-Saharan Africa, we found that almost 30% of the World Heritage List in danger is in Africa. And of those, over half of the sites have been on this list for almost 2 decades, and others even more. And the main reasons for this, although we have others, then one concerns difficulties and weaknesses in terms of the management and conservation, in terms from infrastructure, skills, and funding, but also uncontrolled development. And we also have natural disasters, mostly associated with climate change, and also man-made disasters. So this is a quick scan in what the state of conservation then reveal over a period of 10 years, where we see that apart from development, issues of conservation and management in terms of being the ability to be able to plan and prepare has been critical and a huge contributor to the current situation. So it was recognizing that despite the work of the fund in terms of contribution, capacity building in the areas of, for instance, disaster preparedness and capacity building in other areas, the fund had not yet engaged on a comprehensive program in relation to climate change and how to tackle those effects of climate change on many of the over 137 sites. So despite the noteworthy work that has been done mostly through UNESCO and other partners, this has been one of the weakness. And this is why we, together with other partners such as ICOMOS, the fund has gladly joined effort with other climate concerned institutions from art, culture, and heritage to then try through a network of these different organizations address the issue of not only the impact of climate change on heritage, but also how the different approaches can actually inform our efforts in terms of assisting state parties to conserve and contribute to World Heritage in Africa. So it was then through the work of the Climate Heritage Network and our association that we have recently joined forces with other partners such as the Queen's University in Belfast, University of Highlands in Ireland, ICOMOS, but also state parties in Africa, as I said, part of Nigeria, and Tanzania, to then look into one of the strategic ways that we would then be looking into how to understand the impact of climate change on heritage, which has been one of the key weaknesses when it comes to understanding the effects of climate change, but also how to provide effective tools to be able to measure and assist when it comes to conservation and management. So this is how the project on vulnerability and assessment of the impact of climate change then come about. And the project aims to increase the capacity of African heritage professionals and communities to adapt to climate change impacts at cultural sites, mainly bringing this experience, which has now been tried and developed for natural sites, but now will be then tried for cultural sites. And one of the ways is by exploring the climate change drivers and impacts on these sites, and how actually to quantify the physical and social and economical vulnerability of such impact over the communities who preserve their sites. So then this is a pilot project which is then focusing on two of the sites in Africa. So one is on the East African coast, which is a coastal site of Kilwa Kiswani, which has been severely affected by the impact of climate change from sea level rise, which and its turn exacerbates the marine thermal inspection, but also the intense cyclonic activity. So those are sort of the effects that we found, and those are some of the issues that would affect the site. On the other hand, we also have the site further north, the Surami cultural landscape. So both are World Heritage Sites, which is also present several, has been impacted at a different level by climate change. So for instance, in the case of Surami, the site has been threatened by cumulative impact of changing weather events, rainfall, which on its turn impacts on feed security and feed production, and among others. So those are some. Those are, despite being only a pilot phase, what is hope that the CVI project will then contribute first through capacity building to increase our understanding of the impact of climate change on heritage, but also to grow the capacity of stakeholders from communities and heritage practitioners to actually being able to understand and improve. And this project fits within the global general concerns from Africa World Heritage Fund in relation to the Sustainable Development Agenda, but more specifically on how World Heritage actually contributes to this. And here we look into, for instance, not only how the UNESCO policy on sustainable development and World Heritage is implemented in Africa, but more also on the critical role of the youth, and how the youth then plays a role in taking climate action, and using heritage as this tool to actually not only understand but also engage on issues of the impact of climate heritage. Thank you for your attention.
Great, thank you very much, Albino. We see in your presentation, and we saw it in Sandeep's as well, this sort of cruel irony that communities that often made the least contribution to the phenomenon of climate change in terms of their carbon footprint are on the front lines of the impacts of climate change. And it's nice to see this example of solidarity between the global north and the global south in trying to address climate change, something we need much more of. I want to encourage you to keep in mind questions you might have for our speakers. After our last panelist, we'll have a Q&A session, but you can start putting your questions for Sandeep and Albino into the chat box now, and we'll collect them and pose them shortly. So for our last speaker, I want to give the floor to Alice Lyle. Alice is the head of World Heritage at the heart of Neolithic Orkney World Heritage Site in Scotland. In fact, the last time I saw Alice was at Scale Bay at Scare Bray in Orkney. I'm sorry we're not there today, but Alice, excited to hear your presentation, and the floor is yours.
Thank you for that introduction, Andrew, and I'll just jump straight in. I am also actually going to be speaking about the climate vulnerability assessment approach, but with a specific focus on the heart of Neolithic Orkney and Orkney. So, sorry a minute, I just need to minimize this window as well. So yeah, as we all recognise, climate change is now recognised as the fastest growing threat to World Heritage properties worldwide, and many are already experiencing negative impacts, damage and degradation. And essentially, this is an existential threat. I'm going to look at the climate vulnerability assessment approach from a Heart of Neolithic Orkney point of view. Just to give you a quick little bit of context, the World Heritage Site that I'm involved in the management of is located on an archipelago called Orkney. It's off the northeastern corner of Scotland. It's quite an exposed area. It sits between the North Atlantic and the North Sea, and it's basically 4 Neolithic monuments about 5,000 years old, a settlement site at Scare Bray, a burial site at Maze Howe, Chambered Tomb, and 2 really large stone circles / henge monuments. The World Heritage Site is small, but it has a large 2-part buffer zone around it, as you can see on the left. And just to give you an idea of the kind of vulnerability at this very specific site, this is where the settlement of Skara Brae is located on the Bay of Scale. If you go straight out to sea from there, you eventually hit Canada. There's nothing else in the way, so it's very exposed. It was protected by seawall in the early 20th century, and that seawall is still being extended and looked after. The quote at the top right is just a little quote about a poem written about Skara Brae by Arcadian poet and writer George Mackay Brown, just to highlight the fact that obviously the archaeological and cultural heritage of Orkney is intrinsically bound up with the intellectual, social, cultural life of the people that actually live there. So Orkney is one World Heritage Site out of over 1,000 worldwide. And obviously these sites are cultural, natural, mixed, although as we discussed the other day in another session, that is quite an artificial division. Climate change is an existential threat to many of these sites and is likely to be an existential threat to more of them in the future. As Dr. Dupella mentioned in the previous presentation, some sites are placed on the World Heritage List in danger. There's about 53 sites on that at the moment. This might be out of date because it's a graphic from last year. But we have a bit of an issue, because if World Heritage Sites are to a great extent all going to be impacted by climate change, simply putting sites on the World Heritage List in danger when that assumes that the state party, nation on which the property is located, are able to do something about it, allowing that they have both the will and the resources to do so, is perhaps not actually reasonable. And we certainly can't put hundreds, if not most sites on the World Heritage Danger. So one of the drivers of the CVI approach was to come up with an approach that would allow you to handle this issue, to provide a tool. The other issue is the sheer diversity of World Heritage Sites. There are cathedrals, there are rock art sites, there are coral reefs, there are walled cities, there are Neolithic monuments, there are cultural landscapes. The variety of the sites is so broad and so deep that essentially you're in a situation where, rather than comparing variety to variety, we're looking for a way, or the purpose behind this was in part to be able to compare apples to apples, to have some kind of baseline to say which of these sites are the most threatened as part of the process of then deciding what to do about it. This was developed by James Cook University with support from Union of Concerned Scientists initially in Australia at Shark Bay. A CVI assessment was carried out for this site, which is a natural World Heritage Site. But following on from that, there was a desire to test this at a cultural site. So the first time this approach was trialled at a cultural World Heritage Site was at the Heart of Neolithic Orkney. And there were various reasons for that, including the obvious vulnerability of the site to climate impacts, but also the fact that Historic Environment Scotland, who I work for, we directly manage the 4 proper sites that make up the property. And we have done quite a lot of work in looking at climate and heritage, mitigation, adaptation, assessing levels of risk. So there was a lot of expertise there. There was also expertise in the University of the Highlands and Islands, Orkney College, particularly in the Archaeology Institute there. And we had support from Union of Concerned Scientists to pick it, and we actually had the involvement of James Cook University Australia as well, and support from the ICMOS Heritage Working Group as well. So it all came together in a I don't want to say a perfect storm given the topic, to carry out the assessment there. What we were looking at there is basically what are the climate drivers and how do they impact the outstanding universal value of the site. So all World Heritage Sites have this outstanding universal value, which is a unitary value. All of the features and attributes of a site that go together become, perhaps the best way to sum it up, is greater than the sum of its parts. They form the universal value, and it's supported by basically 3 pillars. It meets the criteria to be inscribed on the World Heritage List. The site has integrity, it's intact and it is all there. It has authenticity if it's a cultural site as well. And it has a robust protection and management process in place. And that doesn't have to be a management plan, although that is the way that we operate in Scotland and our World Heritage Sites. That can be traditional management systems, etc. It depends on the cultural context of the site. But if any of these pillars are undermined or damaged by any process, you could then lose your outstanding universal value. And basically what we are talking about here is the values of the site. Outstanding universal value is expressed in a statement of outstanding universal value. Orkney's site was inscribed in 1999, but we didn't actually formulate a statement until 2011, and it was accepted by the World Heritage Committee in 2013. And that statement sets out the criteria of inscription. It describes how the site meets that. It notes its authenticity and integrity, and it also sets out the protection and management of the site. And that document, and this will become evident, and this document is fixed not in stone, but once it's written, it's the document that you work from. And this can be an issue because obviously, even in the last slightly less than a decade, understanding of sites changes, and the way we think about sites changes. And I think most importantly, the way we understand the value of a site can change. However, the description of the site and the criteria it's inscribed under cannot change, because otherwise you wouldn't have robust protection for the site, and it would open up the possibility of people chipping away at, for instance, the integrity or authenticity of the site while trying to claim it still has outstanding universal value. So this can be a bit of a challenge for sustainable management of a site, because management is not a fixed system either. It has to develop through time. And when we're thinking about value, and this is one of the things that we thought about as part of the CVI process, the values that go to make a site of World Heritage status are not the only values associated with the site. They are the values that have been identified as making it important to forever for everyone around the world. But as this map, which is a map that we made with the community of the Central West Mainland part of the World Heritage Site a few years ago, demonstrates, there are many more values associated with every World Heritage Site. And these are just some of the things that local people, children and adults, value about the site, represented in their own words and with some of their own drawings. And often the locally important values are not this identical with the World Heritage values, but you cannot sustainably manage a site or understand its importance to the people who live next to it, work next to it, perhaps as part of their economic life. Tourism is a big, really important part of Orkney's economy. But the landscape around this site is farmed, for instance. These people have a real interest in the future of this site, but they also need to see, tangible benefits from it. So we need to also manage the site for these values. And one of the things we did as part of the preamble to the CVI workshop was look at some of the other significant values, local, regional and national, associated with the site. And these are all contained in the report. There's a link at the end if you wish to read it. And that includes intangible values as well. So that's kind of the background. The actual CVI workshop was quite an intense process. We didn't just consider the values beforehand, including the outstanding universal value. We also, there was a webinar available to try and make sure we were all starting from a similar baseline understanding of the climate science that underlay the workshop. It ran over 3 days in Orkney, 36 participants and 2 site visits. 50% of the participants live and work locally. And that was really important, actually, because although we had international expert input, we also had local expert input, a really wide range of experience. And those local experts, be they tour guides or people who work in wind energy or people who work in the art sector or archaeologists or other researchers, they are all part of the community as well. Their investment in the site is not only as professionals, their expertise also comes from living right next to it. Some of the archaeologists who participated live within sight of 50% of the monuments that go to make up the World Heritage property. So we, to run quickly through this bit, we looked at what the 3 key climate drivers were that might impact the OUV out of a potential list of more. And perhaps not very surprisingly, we came up with sea level change, precipitation change, and storm intensity and frequency. And what we then did is, this is perhaps the straightforward part, is we went through a process to address the likely vulnerability of the OUV to these drivers individually and then combined. And the OUV has a high vulnerability. That perhaps is not rocket science. But the next part of the CVI thing was actually probably the more interesting part, because we then moved on to assess the community vulnerability to these 3 climate drivers, looking at economic, social and cultural dependencies, as discussed actually in more detail by Dr. Dipela. But what is interesting about this to me is that we had to bear in mind, and it was quite difficult to draw these lines sometimes, we had to bear in mind that we were assessing the vulnerability of impacts on the community from impacts on the OUV. We weren't trying to assess the potential vulnerability of the community to general impacts of climate change or general impacts on heritage. So this is quite focused. So it may be very different for different sites. But one of the interesting things about this is, although there was a high potential impact, sort of knock-on impact on economic, social and cultural issues, the community vulnerability was only moderate, and the reason for that was that we'd identified that there was a really high adaptive capacity in the local community, and a lot of that is to do with the values that both the World Heritage Site and the wider heritage had for the community and the way that they interact with it. So what does this mean for our next steps? We are in the process of developing a new management plan for the World Heritage Site. It was supposed to be developed in 2021 and published then, but there is a minor issue of an international pandemic that's put all of our timetables back. But on the plus side, this means that we haven't written a management plan that was immediately incredibly out of date. And the CVI process and its engagement with the potential impacts on community has been a really important part of that step. I should say that the workshop was carried out in 2019. We've recognised, partly through this process, that climate change mitigation and adaptation must be woven through the management plan for the World Heritage Site, and they can't just be bolted on at the end. The community and sustainability everything has to kind of flow from that focus on community engagement and involvement. We've since carried out a 2-month-long community engagement thing, and that is essentially, we heard, I guess, what we should have already known, and perhaps sometimes was quite hard to hear, but that we need to do much better at that. There's clearly a role for heritage more broadly in the World Heritage Site, in particular in the post-COVID recovery and contributing to Orkney and Scotland's climate goals, and thereafter obviously into international climate goals. And it was really important, to think about how we can share the benefits of World Heritage more broadly, make sure we're delivering really genuinely sustainable management and not just box ticking, and equitably sharing the benefit of World Heritage status with a wider Orkney community. So not just the people with immediate proximity, but across the archipelago. And finally, if this year has taught us anything, it's that we have to have flexible delivery, active, not reactive. The next steps for CVI in Scotland are that we're looking to carry out CVI assessments for all of the remaining 5 current World Heritage Sites in Scotland. I was going to speak about next steps elsewhere, but actually Dr. Dipela has covered that in much more detail in his presentation. So I'll just leave you with, and these will be shared afterwards, a link to the CVI report itself for Orkney. There's a short video on YouTube which gives a bit more of the background and some nice pictures of Orkney. And for wider CVI resources and upcoming events, cvi-heritage.org. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Alice. I think many in the session may know that the UNESCO World Heritage Committee is currently updating the World Heritage Policy on climate change. And I had a chance to be involved in that process, and it stresses the need for science-based, community-led, values-driven vulnerability assessment at sites, and this seems like a perfect example of that. So thank you for that presentation. We now have about 10 minutes for questions. My colleague, Francesca Giliberto, who is the impresario of this conference, I think has been collecting some from the chat. And Francesca, do you have one or two questions you want to elevate?
Yes, here I am. So thank you everybody for the great questions you posed in the chat. So I was trying to collect all of them. So I think we can start with a couple of questions posed by Winfred. So she's from Kenya in Africa, and she's asking, given the diversity in African states in terms of cultural practices and languages, is there a roadmap to preserving this? This is the first question, and then we have a second question with a comment. So she says, we are majorly an agricultural dependent economy, meaning climate change is a great concern to us. And there are a number of traditional methods that were always used to ensure that local crops would mature even with the minimum rains. So how is the AU, I think is the African Union, help countries and communities that already have these skills in place? So one question is about a roadmap for African states to preserve sites and practices, and the other one is how the African Union can help countries and communities that already have these skills in place.
I can try. So in relation to, I will start with the second one. One of the categories of sites that we may find on the World Heritage List are the agricultural landscapes. And if we look just near in East Africa, we can look at Konzo cultural landscape in Ethiopia, which basically is this extensive dry stone terraces, which witness a persistent human struggle to use and harness hard, dry rock environment. So what then the site attests to is how terraces retain soil erosion, collect maximum water, and so it basically attests to that human ingenuity in adapting to the environment. One of the things that at the African World Heritage Fund we were able to do was to try to document the traditional management systems that are still in place and that are very effective in managing some of the World Heritage sites, including Konzo was part of the study, in order to show how such systems would be complementary or at times more effective than the different systems that might be in place, which would, for instance, disregard the traditional knowledge and the traditional systems. So the argument was to try and show how this log knowledge imbued in the communities is not only has Sandeep basically showed in his presentation that, I mean, that is what the driver for a more effective action when it comes to mitigating the impacts of not only climate change, but also the adverse conditions that one would find in the environment. And I should make a note that I would not speak on behalf of the African Union because I can only report on the work of the Africa World Heritage Fund. Thank you.
There's a question that plays on the answer that Albino just gave about indigenous knowledge, and I think we could probably add to that traditional knowledge of local communities. Sandeep touched on that quite a bit as well. And so could the panelists speak to to the incorporation of indigenous knowledge into climate response? How do we get heritage constituencies to focus on intangible heritage, and how do we get indigenous knowledge and traditional knowledge valorized as climate technology and included in climate action?
I think we need to consider traditional knowledge, heritage, and climate adaptation into one framework rather than separately. I think given the situation at the moment in terms of how these issues intersect, I think any kind of research that looks at heritage also needs to address issues of climate adaptation, resilience, traditional and indigenous knowledge, all together. So I think it's moving to a kind of research framework where these issues are thought as interrelated and connected, rather than viewing heritage and climate as kind of distinct, each having its own constituency. I think a more effective way of going about research, given the seriousness of the times we live in, is to make all these issues speak to one another. And as a result, I think we can develop a far better understanding of the connections between all these issues. So I think that would be some kind of a direction of travel I would propose.
I mean, if I may, I think if we depart from the conception that the traditional knowledge basically is part of the system, which is firmly anchored on in the intangible heritage, I mean, ethical values, social customs, belief system, those are all part of the intangible heritage. And that the communities are largely informed by this set of system and cosmology. So when we look into how communities will then respond to the challenge posed in a certain environment, some created by the changing climate and other factors. Then when we sort of discuss and think of managing such change, then that the so-called traditional knowledge, the traditional systems, then becomes at the forefront of that conception of adaptation and mitigation. I think the great challenge we face, at least in relation to within the framework of World Heritage Sites, is that often the management systems are conceived or conceptualized in a broader sort of framework, which then only relegate, I would say, a small role to such to the traditional systems, which are informed by local knowledge. And I think that is one of the great challenges. And it would be through the allowing those traditional systems to basically take more control in terms of the management of resources, which will also allow more effective responses to the challenge posed by climate.
Great, thank you, Albino. We have time for one last question, and I'll pose that to Alice. Alice, there's a question in the chat about the sort of constructed distinction between nature and culture. And at a philosophical level, there's a lot that could be said about that, but I want to ask you about a practical dimension of it. It seems clear from the presentation you gave, ascertaining and assessing downscaled modeling of precipitation and sea level rise and its impacts on erosion and landscapes, that there must have been a lot of collaboration between your team and colleagues in the nature field. And so could you speak a little bit to how you integrated nature and culture functionalities and approaches in the work you did?
I guess I can to an extent, although I should say that I was there firmly with my archaeologist/heritage manager hat on. It was definitely a collaborative process. And that stuff was kind of filtered in through the climate experts. Because I should say that, for instance, the James Cook team, are coming from a natural heritage perspective and looking at climate change science. But it sparked a lot of broader discussions at the actual workshop, you may recall, which is that it's very difficult when you have a site that you've put an artificial line around to actually separate it from the wider context, even from a cultural heritage perspective, and attempting to separate the impacts on the sites from the impacts on what we still separate off as natural heritage were really quite difficult. And it's particularly as soon as you get to intangible values, because that sense of place, those things about the site in the present and trying to imagine what the landscape might have looked like in the past are completely inseparable from that, the current environment. And I guess one of the things that we discussed is we don't know, and one of the potential areas for future research is we need to understand more what other drivers might impact the wider landscape and the actual wider context of the site. And that isn't just about other monuments in that landscape. It's also about things like what's the vegetation cover like, not only what are the farmers growing, but what's the natural vegetation going to look like if we have higher air temperatures. A degree or two could make a huge difference there. What if we lose the birds that make up so much of the soundscape when you actually experience the site, and what does that mean for people's experience of the sites? But there is lots more research to do about that, because actually I would say that part of the problem is that we do still have a bit of a siloization in research between the natural and the cultural heritage. And we aren't, perhaps as a national heritage agency, we aren't working closely enough with our counterparts in what used to be called Scottish Natural Heritage and is now Nature Scot. But there is that false division even in the way that we think about the things that we are managing and the way we manage it. We are trying to work better in a kind of holistic scale, both for World Heritage and other sites, where we don't just look at the site, where we look at the site and what is around it and how it interacts with other things in the environment. But I think we have a lot of work to do, even just in Orkney, actually, just at that one site.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I think even just the act of including on your team colleagues from natural heritage and climate science is an important tip to folks. Thank you, Alice. Well, thank you for all those questions. I'm sorry we didn't get to all of them, but we can explore them further in the breakout groups. And so now I'd like to turn it over. I think it's to Francesca to lead us to the breakout rooms. Francesca?
Okay, yes, hello everybody. So now we are moving into breakout groups. Some of you already know because you have attended the session today, but you will be automatically assigned into a breakout group.
We can, yeah, thank you.
Okay, sorry, thanks. Sure, happy to start. It looks like we have about 4 to 5 minutes for each room. So I'll try to stay to that. In the interest of time, our breakout group decided to focus on 2 questions. Number 1, how can cultural heritage better contribute to tackling climate change? And number 4, about improving partnerships and collaborations. Regarding the first, we had a really far-reaching conversation. Interestingly, a lot of focus on greenhouse gas reduction and the mitigation side of climate change, looking at our role in that across sectors, buildings, and using traditional knowledge to decarbonize the built environment. A good conversation about tourism, which is sort of the dirty secret of cultural heritage, because it's an area where we contribute a lot to greenhouse gas emissions. And how do we decarbonize tourism? And also just transition. What about tourism dependent communities and how do we equitably decarbonize? We also talked about the need for interdisciplinarity in our approach in order to improve our contributions, the need to break out of silos, listen to different voices, collaborate with STEM and climate science, work as much with the Ministry of Environment as the Ministry of Culture. We talked about the role of cultural heritage in impacting consumption and production patterns, recovering traditional knowledge from a pre-carbon era about how to consume and make things for inclusive growth. We talked about the need for our approach is to emphasize locally led approaches, to learn from local people. And we talked about how we can signal urgency in our work. For instance, how the impacts on an iconic place like Venice can signal the need for urgency in climate action. So I'm afraid I'm not doing, we also talked about the need to get our own house in order. So our own cultural institutions, our own organizations, how do we green them? So I may not be doing justice to all the topics, but those are some of them. And then lastly, we talked about partnerships. Different kinds of partnerships. We need to focus on local communities and enabling community-led partnerships. At the same time, we need to be more transversal, and so we need to be partnering with climate scientists. We need with the environmental sector, with others, not just talking to ourselves in heritage. At an international level, we need to enable more South-South partnerships rather than thinking that folks in the global North are leading all these conversations. At the same time, we need to have solidarity in the global North for frontline communities. We talked about the need to be mindful of inequality and how different communities are experiencing climate change differently, and also the fact that we can learn from heritage methodologies to guide our partnerships. For example, from archaeology, we learned that it's not about us, it's about the communities we're working with. So those were some ideas from our group.
Firstly, thank you to all those wonderful people who were in a breakout room with me, who contributed some really, really worthwhile and thought-provoking comments. So my summary is a tribute to their intelligence entirely, and I hope I do it justice. So we started quite broadly. With almost the conversation that always begins with the idea of definitions and the danger of definitions. So we talked about making sure that when we're talking about heritage, people know that that can be all sorts of things, and that it isn't just necessarily built heritage, intangible, archaeology, whatever it may be, but that food and farming and cultural practices are very much part of that. But then that was followed by a very strong caution that we need to be careful that we are not defining the heritage of other people, that actually what we are empowering them to do is to define their own heritage in their own words, but to give them encouragement about the breadth of things that may be within that. We then moved on to talk about academics and research, and there was a very heartfelt plea that academics need to spend time in the communities that they are studying, that they are working with, that they actually really need to get to know the local people, the local situations and scenarios, the constraints, the opportunities, the challenges, the different things that have been done, so that the research is bedded in genuine and deep knowledge, rather than anything that can risk being a little superficial. And perhaps to go beyond that, to actually more determinedly look to co-create pieces of work, working with local people and designing and carrying out that research with them, which slightly sort of segued into a conversation about collaboration. Collaboration is most certainly a very good thing, but only if it is done well and it is done with genuine positive intent. And how do we make that happen? Well, perhaps what we need, what the ask is for better understanding of good collaborative tools, so that people know how to begin conversations in a way that will generate good results. So we need to learn to be good collaborators. And of course, there's an allied point there about making sure that everyone's objectives are aligned. So often private practice is involved in collaborative projects, but sometimes perhaps commercial interests are at play, that the profit and loss may be an issue. And so we need to recognize that there are different motivations within collaboration and deal with that effectively. One last point for me then, which is a little bit about trying to raise our visibility. There is a lot of good things happening, but it's sometimes difficult to find the information, to know who to ask, to find the case study that actually helps. So I think perhaps one very practical action or ask from today might be that each of us, and there's 100 of us still in this call, could go away with a promise to shine a light on some brilliant work being done by some colleagues elsewhere. So if we each signpost and highlight the work of one or more other people, then that will absolutely raise the volume and raise the profile of lots of good things. So there you go. Something very practical to do tomorrow, and that's us.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. Sarah is coordinating the Climate Heritage Network working group on culture, climate change, and communications, and I appreciate your concrete communication and action items. Next, I want to give the floor back to Dr. Japela and ask Albino if he would report out from his breakout group.
Andre, we had a volunteer in our group, so it will be Emanuela Fragoso to report back.
Perfect. Manuela?
Okay. We start to speak about the impact of travel and heritage. So the question of the sustainable tourism and the importance of transportation, local and international, to get people from one side to the other. The discussion went also to the question of the embodied energy in buildings and reduction of CO2, and how can we can improve policies in local or at national level. And as an example, as a reduction of taxes or an increase of taxes, if we are working in cultural heritage or in making changes in sites of cultural heritage, so investment or more taxation. For the other side, we also, it was also discussed the question of the connection between technology and information and cultural heritage, and how we can introduce more collaboration between the technology sector and the heritage sector. And in the end, we also were focused on that we have to influence also the politicians that are in fact making decisions for us. That cultural heritage is in danger now. There are examples, not only at national caring heritage, but also an international view. Like they didn't spoke about one example, but we can speak about Venice, and taking that to the next big meeting as an example of sensibilization for the problem.
Okay, great. Thank you, Emanuela. And last but not least, room 4 and Alice Lyle. Alice, could you direct us to your group's report?
Yes. Okay. Am I unmuted? Sorry, my screen's gone a bit strange. I think it's working now. I'll try not to simply repeat anything that other people have said, so it's possible that my report will end up being slightly shorter than some of the others, but we shall see. And apologies about any stomping noises, as the children upstairs have just started their evening migration, I think, across the floor. Yeah, we kind of bounce back and forth between a lot of the questions in the course of it, so I might just go through it in the order in which it was noted. We started out by discussing one example of a particular cultural heritage-based intervention that helps to tackle a very local aspect of climate change, but actually we thought was maybe a good example of how small interventions can make a big change in one place, and then potentially that can have knock-on effects. It was looking at the green zone in Florence, where, as I think many people are aware, they have issues with over-tourism and gentrification, but there's also problems both with climate change and I guess with gentrification and visitor numbers with heat in the summer, particularly in the height of the tourist season. So creating kind of local oases in the historic centre helps to improve both the life of citizens, but also it helps the local microclimate and helps to make it less of a heat sink. And it also helps to keep the citizens in Florence. So I guess we're also talking about the preservation of intangible heritage as well as improving the actual local climate. And certainly I thought that there's something there about the way that sometimes we think about large-scale interventions, but perhaps cumulative small-scale interventions are important as well. And also the fact that you're benefiting the residents of a place in a very physical and experiential way, I think can help to bring people into that conversation about climate change. We also discussed a little bit about whether or not, on a completely different scale, the heritage and science community could assist in identifying and helping identify and help places that are most in danger from climate change, thinking specifically about coastal and low-lying places. And we had a really interesting point of view from one of the attendees from Bahrain, talking about small island states and thinking about different ways to approach heritage, and wanting to be clear that we need to treat different places in their unique context. And first of all, not assume that because somewhere is close to other places, that everyone in a region shares the same issues, that because of their island situation, having policies that are for a region that don't address the specificities of climate challenges to heritage in that location and in that particular culture can be a real issue. But this wasn't a call for people to show up as external experts and fix the problem. It was more like a desire for proper recognition of the unique nature of that place, and almost to get out of the way and make sure people have what they need to address it themselves. People say we know what to do, but we need a recognition that we understand our own issues best. So it's about awareness more than just identification. And I thought that was quite interesting, because from an Orkney perspective, one of the things that I've heard discussed many times for both that archipelago and others is the notion of islandness and the way that impacts the way people interact with their heritage, which is interesting because so many island nations and communities have climate issues to address. We had a very different view, which suggested that perhaps the problem was that heritage was about splitting, not bringing people together, and that an excess focus on people's unique and separate cultures could be divisive, and that in order to address an all humanity challenge like climate change, we should look for what aspects of heritage foster solidarity rather than focusing on individual sites. And I don't think this was a cry to eliminate difference or treat everywhere the same, but to look at how heritage is all of our responsibilities rather than the responsibility of individual groups looking at their own heritage. But in terms of addressing climate change, it was pointed out that this is both something for us all to do, but in all ways, and including for a heritage perspective, we need to be mindful that we're not reinforcing the existing inequalities between different places and locations, and that we can't simply make things better by ignoring the issues that already exist. We also had an interesting intervention talking about a particular specific area of speciality, which is building information management, which looking about the way that data sets and overlapping aims work with climate change. But really this was part of a broader ask, which was we probably all need to do better within both our heritage specialisms and wider specialisms at looking outside and finding out who we should be working with and how we can better leverage our different areas of expertise and overlapping data sets, so we're all pulling in the same direction to solve some of these problems. We also talked about things like a green tourism in the restart post-COVID, and looking at giving more attention to the convergence of heritage sustainability and behavioural issues and production and consumption, and how heritage can promote sustainable production and consumption. We did talk about more things, but those, I guess, are the standout points for me. And thank you very much to Charlie Kennedy for sending me his notes just before I had to feed back, which was really helpful. And thanks to everyone who participated in our breakout session as well.
Yeah, thank you very much, Alice. I mean, it sounds like such a rich conversation in all these rooms. This conversation is so timely. Just a few weeks ago, the UN Environment Agency, UNEP, released their 2020 emissions gap report, which shows that the world is dangerously off course to meeting the Paris Agreement targets. We're headed to 3 degrees of global warming over pre-industrial levels, which would be catastrophic. And so there's a desperate search for new strategies and new ways to tackle climate change. Culture and heritage, that dimension has largely been missing from the equation, and it is desperately needed. And so many ideas surfaced today about how we can flip that paradigm and really be a part of the solution. It's been fantastic. So I think now I'm to turn it back over to Tilly for closing comments. Tilly?
Thanks, Andrew. And thanks, everyone. It was really interesting to sit back and listen to all of that, especially coming from a biological sciences perspective. Is actually my specialism. So it's interesting to hear about the environmental issues and things that heritage can contribute to. So thank you. I think I've learned a lot today, which is great. I just wanted to basically thank Andrew as the chair. You've done a great job. We really appreciate it. Thank all of our panelists for your fantastic presentations. This session has been recorded. And so afterwards, we will work to edit that into some form of video to upload onto our website. So if you want to go back and watch yourself, or if you want to go back and see the presentations again or share with colleagues who couldn't be here, then please, by all means, do. I think, to be honest, that's about it. I'm happy to wrap up, really, and just remind everyone that the conference is still going on. It's not a one-day thing. And as we near the end of the week, we're having a slightly alternative day tomorrow with some sessions where we'll have a bit of live music, quite a few videos. We'll have some storytelling. We're going to confront some issues around decolonizing heritage practices. We're going to hear from Richard Gustavish, president of a First Nation community in Canada. And it's set to be a really interesting day. So please, by all means, register, come along, join us for even more discussions. And thank you so much for your time once again.